we were listening to by an Estonian composer, Arvo Pärt. The piece is called When Sarah Was 90 Years Old. When Sarah was 90 years old, what happened? She had a child for the first time, her first child. So you hear, as Professor Johnson was telling me, he selected the music this morning, the barrenness, the desert, and then you hear conception, birth. Here is the conception of the first man in God's mind and out of God's doing. A couple quick announcements before we start. Students in Professor Nelson's section, today 2 to 3:30, classroom has been moved. So if you're in Professor Nelson's section from 2 to 3:30 today, come to CAS 213. CAS 213, anybody who's in Professor Nelson's section. The Writing Center, I know there's been some confusion as to where that is, so I will just remind you that it's in room 130, 130 in CAS. There's a very misleading sign on a certain other room which I wanted to mention, but CAS 130 is the room where you want to go for the Writing Center. Tutors are there, they're there at the appointed hours in room 130. So we come to the first of our coordinating lectures. These are lectures designed to pull together and provide context for the various points of view we have been hearing. To do that for us, we are very fortunate to have as our lecturer this morning, Professor James Johnson. Professor Johnson is from the Department of History, has taught in the Corps for a number of years, has been part of the evolution and design of the Corps. In fact, these coordinating lectures are largely his idea. High quality of Professor Johnson's teaching has been recognized by his receiving the Metcalf Award, the university's highest award for excellence in teaching. His scholarly interests center around European, cultural, and intellectual history. He's written a book you might be interested in, Listening in Paris, A Cultural History, about how music was thought about and listened to in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, a time of huge changes in music and huge changes in politics and history, as I hope you know. Professor Johnson, as some of you may also know, is a fine pianist who performs and lectures on Bach, on Mozart, and Beethoven on some wonderful evenings in the Corps in the sophomore year. As an intellectual historian and longtime Corps professor, Professor Johnson will be providing a historical perspective on the works we've been reading, Gilgamesh and the Bible. We looked at the Bible from a number of perspectives. Now we put it in that larger historical perspective together with Gilgamesh. And Professor Johnson will be linking together some of the ideas and approaches we have been offering to these two works. It's a very great pleasure to have him as our lecturer today, Professor James Johnson. Professor Johnson.
Professor Jorgensen, good morning. Nice to see you. Thank you for forgiving my cold. I hope that I last in this lecture. And I hope it's not too unpleasant to listen to. The first coordinating lecture. The idea behind coordinating lectures, as Professor Jorgensen was saying, is slightly different from the informational lectures that you've heard so far. That is, it's more reflective on where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. It's a way somehow of making these different approaches in the discussions and in the various lectures somehow fit together, coordinate with one another. We don't want you to feel lost in the Corps, and we realize at this point that you're starting to get information from theologians and archaeologists and literary critics and philosophers, and it can sometimes seem to fly apart. So the idea today is to try to bring it all back together. That is, to draw connections among the lectures, to emphasize the connections we've made in the seminars already, and then finally, and that's where my own professional discipline comes in, to put that into historic context so we can anchor it into the sweep of dates. To that end, this lecture has 3 parts, each of them very different. I'll tell you what these 3 parts are at the beginning, and then as we go on, I'll alert you as we move from one to the other. Part 1 will be, how do we read this book? How do we read the Hebrew Scriptures? Part 2 is called Israel's History. And part 3 is called The History of Israel. how do we read this book? As literature? As a collection of stories? As truth? As superstition? As propaganda? We have to grapple with this question, first of all, as we read the Hebrew Scriptures. How do we read this book? Do we read it any differently than the way we read the Epic of Gilgamesh? Do we read it any differently than the way we will read Homer or Plato? And I think your intuition is correct when you say, well, yes, these are different sorts of works. They should not be read in the same way. So how do we grapple with this when we grapple with it head on? Well, the strategy is to look to see where we've been, and that's to look at the Epic of Gilgamesh and see if we can find some interesting dissimilarities between these two ancient texts. In Professor Jorgensen's lecture, he said, the Epic of Gilgamesh is not a sacred text. The Hebrew Scriptures are a sacred text. And this is true whether you are a believer, an agnostic, or an atheist. That the first way to read the Hebrew Scriptures is as a sacred text. What does this mean? They explain the place of the divine in the human order. And what about the Epic of Gilgamesh? The Epic of Gilgamesh explains the place of the human in the divine order. The Hebrew Scriptures therefore establish a human order from God's perspective. They set down moral human laws sanctioned by God. They set limits to human striving, limits established by the divine order. The Hebrew Scriptures are sacred in the same way that the Enuma Elish, the great Mesopotamian creation myth, is sacred. They are sacred in the same way that the Bhagavad Gita, which we'll be reading next semester, is sacred. The Hebrew Scriptures are sacred in the same way that the Quran is sacred and that the Book of Mormon is sacred. Now, I'd like to explore this concept because I can sense already some resistance to this point. Gilgamesh is not sacred. The Hebrew Scriptures are sacred. So let me try to explain what I mean, the truth that we must all acknowledge, believers, agnostics, atheists, that this is a sacred text. Let's go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and let's think about what that story was about, emphasizing the place of the humans within the divine order. The story of Gilgamesh, as we all know very well now, is the story about how King Gilgamesh becomes human. That involves friendship, loss, deep suffering, and finally an acknowledgement of his own limitations. One of my favorite moments in the Core comes in the Epic of Gilgamesh on the last page when King Gilgamesh, with the boatman, is traveling back to the city after he has learned what it is to be human. Loss, death, friendship, limitation. And King Gilgamesh says to the boatman, look at the city, study the brickwork, look at the foundations. And that's both the end and the beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I like to imagine that in fact what's happening at that moment is King Gilgamesh becomes the teller of the story about King Gilgamesh. You begin the book reading a story that begins, study the brickwork, look at the foundations. And it's a story about Gilgamesh. And at the end of the story, he's prepared now, with the knowledge he has gained, to tell his own story. And what is that story? Well, it's the story of an arrogant tyrant who gradually becomes human. He is the man that knows the most of all that men know. And it's the story particularly of rebelling against the divine order. Professor Jorgensen has emphasize the Ishtar scene, a crucial scene in what the Epic of Gilgamesh is all about. Ishtar is all of those many things Ishtar is. The natural order, the reality that we confront. And the Epic of Gilgamesh teaches us what humans do when they rebel in order to be human. They defy Ishtar. Or perhaps, as Professor Zemansky has taught us, they dam up rivers in deserts so they can have human settlements. Or perhaps it's sending humans up in a space shuttle to defy gravity and defy our being limited by the earth, our being limited by the divine order, you might say. Or perhaps it's mastering the DNA code in order to map the human genes. The Epic of Gilgamesh teaches us the human place in the divine order and, moreover, the revolt against the divine order in order to be humans. It also teaches us the costs of that rebellion, that terribly human, painfully human rebellion that's within all of us. What are the costs? Innocent soldiers slaughtered, innocent people slaughtered because of the rebellion against Ishtar, the terrible floods that happen when we dam up rivers and suddenly all of the Midwest is under floodwaters, the Challenger explosion, or perhaps the nightmares that some are sketching now when we have mapped all the human genes. There are costs to this rebellion, but in fact the tone and the structure and the lessons of Gilgamesh are not sacred. They're secular. They're the lessons of humans within this divine order. The knowledge of King Gilgamesh at the end is human knowledge, and his defiance is in a curious way elevated, explored, perhaps even praised, but at great, great cost. The sacredness of the Hebrew Scriptures comes from its emphasis on the divine order and how humans, beginning with a particular group of humans, the Israelites, fit within this divine order. Let's take the story of the Tower of Babel, which is a very close approximation of the defiance of Ishtar. You remember the story of the Tower of Babel. That is, people say, "Come, let us build a tower into the heavens." It's the description of a ziggurat, in fact. People bake clay, they build a tower, as the scriptures say, with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Very close in events of what happens with the defiance of Ishtar. God sees in this pride, arrogance, defiance, ambition. He says this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And he destroys the tower, and he scatters the people. Now, the story may seem similar to the defiance of Ishtar, but in fact, it's set within a narration that begins with God creating the heavens and the earth, God establishing the moral law, God establishing the civil and social law. It continues with God guiding and correcting and overseeing his chosen people. So in fact, the Tower of Babel story is there to show not the elevation of human defiance and the glory and the grasping that we see in Gilgamesh, but in fact, from God's point of view, what happens when human pride and human arrogance gets out of control. Ultimately, the Hebrew Bible is the story of Hebrews working within the divine order. In physical law, in moral law, in secular law, in governmental organization. So, on its own terms, the Bible is sacred in a way that Gilgamesh is not. I hope you're starting now to grasp what I mean. And in fact, we must try to read it from this perspective. If we are not believers, we must try to suspend our disbelief in order to meet it on its own terms. Those terms as a sacred history. The Hebrew Scriptures are not primarily literature. We don't, and we oughtn't read them first and foremost as literature. They're not merely a collection of good stories. In fact, it's how humans were to live in relation to God. How humans were to live in relation to God. Notice the past tense. This is what it means to recognize a text as sacred. The Bhagavad Gita, the Enuma Elish, the Hebrew Scriptures, how humans were to live in relation to God. And when we suspend our disbelief to try to grasp it as a sacred text, then we can start to understand the foreign, the mysterious, the terrifyingly strange, a God who says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, and kill him. Only when we suspend our own disbelief can we start to do that. Now, how do we do it? Fortunately, we have all sorts of helps and aids in trying to suspend our disbelief, to grasp the sacredness, even in its foreignness, perhaps. One way we can do it is through our own imagination, through filling in the gaps. One quality of these scriptures is the silence, from one verse to the next to the next. The silence between when God says to Abram, go, and 25 years later, when he first speaks to Abram again. The silence, and you think, what is Abram thinking? After he's uprooted his family, they've left their family, their home, they wander, and there's silence. Or perhaps the silence when God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, go to Mount Moriah and kill him. And it's 3 days to Mount Moriah. 3 days travel. The silence there. Perhaps the silence when Adam has eaten the fruit, and God knows Adam has eaten the fruit, and Adam knows that God knows that Adam has eaten the fruit, and God says, have you eaten the fruit? We have to use our imagination to fill in that silence. Why has God asked if God knows? The silence between the first creation story and the second creation story. Why are there 2 stories? If this is the way it was, if this is a sacred text, why do we have 2 stories? We must fill in the gap. The silence when Abraham is talking to God about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham says, you can't do that. What if there are 50 good people in that city? If you destroy the cities, outright you destroy the good people. And God says, you know, you're right. Well, maybe I won't if there are 50 good people. And the silence when Abraham thinks, now that's an interesting event that's just occurred. What if there are 25 good people? God says, in fact, you're right. What if there are 25? I wouldn't destroy it for that. There are gaps in this text, and to read it like a novel, where you're turning the pages to get to the end, misses the silences. So that's our first strategy, using our imagination to fill in the gaps. Here's another strategy that we will be pursuing this semester and on through next year into the core, and that is to see how others have filled in the gaps. The history of Western art and Western literature and Western music is filled with brilliant, creative minds filling in the gaps. The same enterprise that you should be embarked on as well, filling in the gaps. So we have behind me here, from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo's great paintings. This is one detail, the creation of Adam. Michelangelo heard, and God said, "Let us create man in our own image." And he thought, what would that be like? Or, for example, Michelangelo also read in Genesis silence when you push the button. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. And then the Lord said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever." Therefore, God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. You can take 3 verses and create from these silences great, vast tableaus. We will read next year one of the greatest of these, Milton's Paradise Lost, which fills in the gaps of the first 3 chapters, and here writes a great epic. Or you might know the novelist Thomas Mann, who writes 1,200 pages on the first 20 chapters of Genesis. It's a way of sparking our imagination, to suspend our disbelief, to understand this as a sacred text. Okay, however, just because it taught people how they were to live in relation to God, does that make it sacred? In other words, does that mean it teaches humans how to live now? Is it a sacred text in the sense that we worship it? Well, for many it is. Not for all. Not for all, but for many it is. And I think it's understanding this distinction and exploring the second sense of the sacred, scriptures that teach humans how to live now in relation to the divine, understanding the second sense that maybe we can clarify some of the frustrating disagreements that we're having in our seminar discussions right now. In the second sense of sacred, you can say that depending on who you are, only one of the following is a sacred text. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Enuma Elish, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Book of Mormon. In the second sense, you cannot say they are all sacred. Because in the second sense, a sacred text is a text that you live with, you learn by, you find the truth of, that you say, yes, this is my place in the divine order. Why are our discussions so frustrating? When someone says, this means that, someone else says, no, it doesn't, it's not there, and the other person says, yes, it is, it's right there. Why is that so? It should teach us something about the nature of religious belief. That is, religious belief is a form of knowledge that is not in the realm of proof and disproof. Let me repeat that, because I think it should go in the notes. Religious knowledge is a form of knowledge that is not in the realm of proof and disproof. What is religious knowledge? The existence of God. That we absolutely must follow the law of Moses and arrange our daily lives around the law of Moses, that love can redeem lives and at all times must be employed even when you are destroyed and spat upon and humiliated. That's the realm of religious knowledge, and it's not in the realm of proof or disproof. Maybe you would say, yes, we must live by the laws of Moses. We must orient our daily lives. We must orient what we eat and don't eat. We must orient when we worship around that. Now, that's not in the realm of proof and disproof. It's a different realm. It's the realm of faith. Faith cannot be proved. In my view, it doesn't make it any weaker or secondary somehow or inferior, but it's a fact that faith cannot be proved. But faith cannot be disproved. And let me tell you a little formulation that might make this clearer. If faith could be proven, then we would all have the same religious beliefs. Because after 2,000 years, people would have gradually come to see the truth proven by logic of faith. But if faith could be disproved, then there would be no religious belief. Why? Because by now, we would have simply dropped faith as having been disproven. So I think in grasping this very difficult truth, we can start to get the status of these kinds of frustrating disagreements that we have in the seminars. That is to say, in the second sense of sacred, the Bible is sacred in a way that cannot be proven. But for those who believe, it's no less sacred for that reason. What is the evidence of the sacredness of the Bible in this second sense? I've given you a lot of evidence in the first sense. What is the evidence of the sacredness of the Bible in the second sense? Well, it's not exactly in the words of the text, but without the words of the text, we wouldn't have it. It's some combination that you can't quite put into reason of our own experience, of where we were born, when we were born, of our own family, perhaps one stunning, singular experience. Why is the Bible a living text for some? Why is it truth for some? Some combination of this, that somehow the text confirms our experience. Somehow these words, when we read them in our own particular situation, family situation, geographical situation, age situation, it makes sense. It illuminates our experience. Seeing the text as sacred in the second sense is another way of filling in the gaps. But we use our own position to fill in those gaps. And what our position may tell us is that, yes, we must follow the Mosaic law. Yes, my experience of reading this text tells me that I must orient what I eat, how I behave when I worship and when I don't, according to these words. But the proof of that is not in the words themselves. So how do we read this text? We're at last able to offer some alternatives. And these are, you might say, and/or alternatives. There's no clear one way of reading this text for the reasons that I've talked about. Because it's sacred in one sense. For some people it's sacred in another sense. For other people it's not sacred in the second sense, but is in the first. So here are the options, I think, of ways of reading this text. Ways that are different from Gilgamesh and will be different from Homer and again will be different from Plato. First of all, I've listed 3 options. No doubt there could be more. One option is as truth, either literal or symbolic truth. That is, of how we should live according to God. The place of humans in following God's law. That is, as the intervention of God in history, which is to say the words point to some higher meaning. And the project in finding their truth is to fill in the gaps. The history of the Midrash, the history of Jewish interpretation on the Hebrew Scriptures, is precisely this project. It is the most subtle use of reason, the most advanced form of logic, the most detailed analysis. That is reason, but it's filling in the gaps of the basic religious belief that it is true. The starting point of sacredness. Let me give you another way of filling in the gaps in this very first way of reading the Bible as true. You may have heard in your seminars, you may see this truth as you read the Bible, this option of reading, that in fact there is a symbolic meaning of the Hebrew Scriptures. Some may say that the three men who come to stand outside the tent of Abraham to announce that he will be a father are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Some may say the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Let me try that again. It's the cold. Some may say the serpent in the Garden of Eden is Satan. But it's not in the text. It's not in the words. It can't be proven. Some may say, for example, that Abraham, being commanded to kill his son Isaac, in fact is a prefiguring of the crucifixion of Jesus. But that's not in the text. So what I'd like you to grasp is that we bring our experience to the reading, and if we consider this sacred, then religious knowledge contains things that cannot be proven or disproven. And as a result, we're very frustrated when we try to make these points, or when we try to argue against these points. You can't shake those kinds of convictions. So I think what we should conclude from this is not that that first manner of reading is invalid, but that it's very good to keep clear in your mind what you can convince people of through reason and what you cannot. And if, in fact, the experience you bring that fills in the gaps is religious knowledge, then it may be, for the purposes of discussion, wise to realize that, acknowledge that, and talk about the things that you can support in the words of the text. So, that's one way of reading this text as the truth. Here's the second way, and I would put and or. And or. As an insight into the human condition. Now, it's and if you think the text is true and sacred in the second sense. It's or if you don't. Because I think we can all read this second way as an insight into the human condition. Which is to say, it's true, this way of reading, whether you are religious or not. Professor Devlin has talked about the psychological types of Saul and David as giving insight into their personalities. And I think it's striking and astonishing that that corresponds somehow with how we hear this, with how we read this. A lecturer from earlier years, whom you'll hear later in this semester, Elie Wiesel, said once in a lecture, anything that is human is already in the Bible. I think that illuminates this second way of reading, as giving insight into the human condition. Anything that is human is already in the Bible. And this could illuminate how we read the story of the Garden of Eden, how we read eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, maybe not as literal truth. Maybe the Garden of Eden never happened. Maybe it never literally existed, but does that mean it's false? No. Because you can find deep human truth in what it means to defy what God tells you to do and pay the consequences, but somehow become more human. We now know the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. You can say there's truth in that way, even if you say, maybe it never existed. The third possible option of reading this text, and again I would put and or. If you're philosophically inclined and led to logic, you can make little charts. Because is it and? Or is it and, or, and then and in the last two? Or is it You follow what I'm doing. Not true, not true, 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 true. Anyway, and or. Thirdly, as a collection of legends and chronicles telling the past of a people. This one is also true whether you're religious or not. It is a document. It is a historical document. And what this document does is collect legends and chronicles by a people for a people. The Israelites have collected their own stories. They've put them together in order to tell their own past. In fact, as it's put together, these stories have 4 beginnings. You have read 4 beginnings. First of all, you open the Hebrew Scriptures, and as you open it, you read, "In the beginning." The action of opening this book is the first beginning. It's the beginning of the holy book of the Hebrews. The beginning is also a beginning. And that's not somehow unnecessary to say. Because the beginning of Homer's Odyssey is not a beginning. It's right in the middle. But here, the second beginning, first the beginning of the book, the second beginning is the beginning of the cosmos. In the beginning, God created. Thirdly, in this book of stories told by a people for a people, is the beginning of humans. And God said, "Let us make man in our own image." And fourthly, the stories and chronicles of a people for a people has the beginning of Israel. And that's when God says to Abram, "Go." We've not been introduced to Abram before. We finish a story, and then God says to Abram, "Go." And that is the fourth beginning of the Israelites. These stories are collected, assembled, related, so that Israelites can learn about themselves and how that connects with the beginning of humans and the beginning of the cosmos. So what we have in this magnificent work that we're reading, as we start to peel away its levels and its layers, is a way of connecting the fourth beginning to the second beginning and putting it together in the first beginning. Now, are you following? This is a way of keeping all of us awake. The fourth beginning is the beginning of the Israelites. Connecting it to the beginning of man, the third beginning, connecting that to the beginning of the cosmos, the second beginning, and finally, putting it all together in the first beginning, that is the book itself. Realm 1 is a matter of personal belief. That is, whether it's true or not. Realm 2, that is, as symbolic description of the human condition, is a matter for all of us. All of us as serious readers must confront this, should confront this. And to dismiss it as superstition or propaganda, that would be like dismissing Homer as superstition or propaganda in Realm 2, and that wouldn't be very wise. So Realm 2 concerns all of us. Realm 3, you might say, is a concern of identity. And I'd like now to talk about Realm 3. Realm 3, a collection of stories and chronicles telling the past of a people. We know from Professor Nelson's lecture that this people is historically oriented. It is the story of God working in time. And that leads us then to part 2. Part 2 of the lecture, Israel's History. What is this story of God working in time? What were the Hebrews telling themselves when they told themselves these stories? What was the meaning of these stories to the Israelites? And again, we're in Realm 3 now. I'm not talking about religious truth. I'm not talking about the human condition. I'm talking now as a historian. What was the meaning of the stories to the Israelites as we read them? Well, we learn several things. First of all, we learn that this people told themselves they came from the cradle of civilization. that I skipped right over. This is Michelangelo and the flood, filling in the gaps of the flood. And finally here is a horrifying and gruesome detail, filling in the gaps of the flood. I'm sorry about that. We'll now move to the map. Back in part 2, Israel's history, the first point is they told themselves they were a chosen people from the very cradle of civilization. Do you remember where the Garden of Eden is? It's said that it's between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. That is not an arbitrary designation, because we learned from Professor Zemansky that that is the cradle of civilization. Doesn't it make sense that we, as a chosen people, in fact, were put in the Garden of Eden? And that Garden of Eden, somehow in the collective memory of humankind, was indeed the place of first human settlements. You'll see on your timeline, on your handout, that around 6000 BC was when these settlements first appeared. This is what Professor Zemansky talked about. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, we have Ur, the city of Ur, this Mesopotamian city of Ur. In fact, as we now look at the fourth beginning in the Hebrew Scriptures, God says to Abram, who lives where? In the city of Ur. Go. It's a wonderful connection. And all we have to do is be attentive to reading that the Garden of Eden, the cradle of civilization, historically the place of the first settlements of humankind, was also where Abram's family came from. You find Ur on the map. They then begin their wanderings, their immigration. They stop along cities along the way ultimately to Palestine, also as you see on the map. Remember now that from Professor Zemansky's lecture, about 3,000 years after the first settlements come the first cities. The first cities of humankind spring up in Mesopotamia. And they're the cities with first the temple, from Professor Jorgensen's lecture, and the ziggurats, and the walls. And the city for the Mesopotamians is the center of family life. This is happening around the year 3000 BC. Now, if you'll, this is, I know, slightly acrobatical at this point, but if you'll just look on the back side of your handout, I'd like to point out one other connection now that we're ready to make. What we have is a rather complicated chart here. This is made out by my colleague George Hoffman, so we thank him for this. If you follow the genealogies, often people think the genealogies are pointless in the Bible and boring, and we should just skip right over them. Not so, because the genealogies are very important in establishing connections. In terms of the narrative of Genesis, when God says to Abram, go, that catches us off guard, because narratively it seems to be a big break at that point. It seems that they've been talking about mythic time and Noah, and then go. But the genealogies tell us something else. That is, Abram, later called Abraham, can be traced directly back to Adam. And it's kind of fun following these genealogies because it all has great logical sense. So through the genealogy, through the geography, Abram is connected to the beginning of time. So this is our first point. What do we know about ourselves, telling stories about ourselves, having them in this holy book, that we are not only God's chosen people, but that we go back to the first man, Adam. He was created directly from God. Here's a second thing we learned from these collections of stories, we as attentive readers. That is, values and ways of life among the ancient Hebrews. We learn much about what it was like in this age, and now I'm going to give it a term, the age of the patriarchs. The age of the patriarchs. The age of the patriarchs includes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the great figures that these stories tell us about. We can glean some details about what their life was like. First of all, that they were nomads. They were shepherds. And that they were not city dwellers. Again, if you look on this sheet on the back, this is entitled The Nomadic Agricultural Duality. Very interesting. You can see that there are two fundamental distinctions for this chosen people. The first was city versus country. And when God says go, it means leave the city. And so we have stories about nomads, people who don't have cities, who don't live in cities, who don't certainly build temples in cities in the age of the patriarchs. And then the second duality, which is very interesting to follow, is the farmer versus shepherd duality. We're told with great specificity what each of these patriarchs did. Was it a farmer or was it a herder? So the world of Gilgamesh is the world of cities. The world of the patriarchs is the world of the land. Think about Gilgamesh. What was beyond the city walls? Think about Professor Jorgensen's lecture. It was wild. It was God-forsaken. It meant death. It meant Enkidu. What does the land mean for the Israelites? The cities are evil. Think about Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. They were destroyed. The cities are the place of evil, and the land that had been so foreign for Gilgamesh, the land is sacred. In fact, the pact with Abraham certainly is spoken in terms of descendants, but it's also spoken in terms of land, isn't it? God appears in nature, in the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, what better symbol for this than where God meets Abram to make the pact? Under the stars, beside a well, outside a tent, near the oak trees in Hebron. So we have a movement breaking with the past. We have a movement, first nomads, shepherds, and gradually establishing the order in Palestine. Now, I'm going to make a kind of complicated point right now, so I hope you listen attentively. What we find in the evolution of the patriarchs from the time of Abraham, finally as it gets into focus in the time of David and Solomon, is a kind of fall from paradise. What do I mean? It's an echo, perhaps, of the Garden of Eden, in which things were perfect and ideal, and there was corruption. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about beginning as shepherds and nomads, holding the land outside the city as sacred, what we have in the time of David is Jerusalem. And agriculture. And cultivation. And I think we can hear the echo of this. The echo of looking back to the ancient golden age when we were shepherds, when we didn't have cities, when cities were evil, when we talked directly to God. God appeared in nature. And what we have later with David and Solomon is a kind of bitter truth of reality. We live in cities now. We have people not following God now. God's not talking to me anymore. We have prophets like Nathan who says, here's what God really is thinking. But God no longer talks to the people in the cities. And so as you read this text, I think this can be a key to otherwise baffling things. Why is it that God does not like the sacrifice of Cain? Cain was a farmer. God preferred the sacrifice of the shepherd Abel. Is it perhaps an echo of that ideal time when we were nomads? And is farming perhaps a fall from that state? I don't know. It's a possible interpretation. And as you study this map then, farmers versus hunters or shepherds, what you'll find again on this handout, if you'll again take a glance at it, is variations on the theme of the hunter neglected, of the shepherd slighted. And I don't know that this is the answer to this, but this is a possibility. How do we explain where we've gotten, we, the contemporaries of David, in cities, cultivating the fields, following agriculture? One way is looking at those who have fallen away, who have been killed, who have gone outside the chosen. It's a kind of nostalgic look back, perhaps, at an earlier time. I'll come back to this point in a moment. We have so far the chosen people going back to the beginning of time. We have also originally nomads versus, as opposed to city dwellers, and then gradually the fading away of that. Thirdly, what do we have about the age of the patriarchs? That you return to the source for your wives. What does Abraham say to the servant when he's ready to marry? When he's ready to marry one of his sons. He says, "You will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites." So he goes back to Mesopotamia. They find Rebekah. Rebekah is related, in fact, to Isaac. She's the first cousin once removed of Isaac. In other words, it would be like you marrying your cousin's daughter or son. That's the relationship. So you go back to the source for your wives, for your family. It's the same sort of thing when Jacob marries Rachel. He goes back to Mesopotamia, and they're first cousins, and they marry. Now, what is the message for the Israelites as they tell themselves these stories? The message is that we Israelites are separate from the surrounding peoples. We are different from all those in Palestine who live surrounding us. The Canaanites, as they're described as a group, but the Hittites, the Edomites, the Jebusites, etc. That we are somehow different, and that we must keep this difference. We must keep this ethnicity, if we use a modern term. In fact, the word Hebrew comes from a word which means beyond. I-B-R-I-M. Hebrew, I-B-R-I-M, literally means from beyond. And I think we can extrapolate that, meaning beyond the Euphrates River. An ethnic particularity that must guard its separateness. It must guard its identity. What else do we learn from these stories? First, that in the age of the patriarchs, there's no political structure. There are no kings. There are no priests in the age of the patriarch. What we have is a structure based on the father's blessing. So important is the father's blessing. We read this again and again and again. It's one of those things that we read and we say, why are we being told this? Why must the father put the hand on the head of the son and bless him? And you start to see, well, there must be some importance here. In a way, it's the replaying of the divine covenant with Abraham. God says to Abraham, "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." And it's a way of perpetuating this blessing in this structure of the Father blessing the Son. But in fact, there's something more subtle happening. And again, to hear between the gaps, to use our imagination, and to see the layers of this text, please take this handout again now. Who are the patriarchs? Noah, Abraham really much more a patriarch than Noah, but coming from Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Three main patriarchs. If we read carefully, we realize that Abraham and Isaac, and also Noah, predict that one son will rule over the descendants of another son. Now take a look at this sheet for a moment. And we find an echo, generation after generation. It's as though it's the same story told with different characters. What is this story? It's the story of an older son being banished. Look at the descendants of Noah. We have Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And we see in this chart that Abraham is descended through Shem. Ham, I hope you recall why he is cursed. Because he sees his father's nakedness. Again, what does this mean? Disrespect to the father? The father's blessing is so important. Perhaps he laughed at his father's nakedness. Perhaps he laughed and mocked him for being drunk. We don't know. We imagine. But in fact, what we do know, Ham is the older brother whom Noah curses. He sends him to the land of the Canaanites. And what does he say? He says, Shem, you will rule over the Canaanites. We hear the story again with Abraham. Abraham's firstborn son is not Isaac. That's his son with Sarah, but the firstborn son is Ishmael, the hunter, son of Hagar. He sends Ishmael out to live with the peoples surrounding the Israelites. And what does he say to Isaac? You will rule over the descendants of Ishmael. And what about Esau and Jacob? You know that story. Esau is older than Jacob just by a small amount. They're twins, but born first. By rights, he should have the father's blessing. He should be the one to carry on the generation of Israelites, but that doesn't happen that way. As you know, in fact, Jacob deceives the father. Esau is banished to go among the peoples surrounding the Israelites. Why do you think we are told this same story again and again? What is the meaning? What is the meaning for us Israelites as we hear this story again and again? Well, in a way, the Israelites are like the younger brother. If you think about it, in expectation of all rational sense, Israel survives. In expectation of the predictable order of things, the younger brother prevails. And in defiance of what you might think would be the natural order, the younger brother rules over the older brother. So in a sense, the history of Israel is very much like the history of the younger son. God makes a special covenant and protects, in defiance of all expectation, the younger son. But I think there's a psychological truth also. What would it mean for the older brother to be banished? What would it mean for Ham, or Ishmael, or Esau not to get what's rightly coming to them? Just imagine psychologically what that must be like. I was the older brother, and now I am a slave. I am beaten by the armies of the younger brother. That would generate extraordinary hatred and ferocity and cruelty. And what part does this play in the stories that the Israelites are telling themselves? It answers the question, if we're the chosen people, and if God is favoring us, why are our enemies surrounding us so intent on destroying us? It's a psychological answer to this question, because in our mythic past, those are our brothers who have been perhaps unfairly taken out of the right succession. Again, it's speculation. All we have to go on are these stories, but I think when we hear echoes in these scriptures, we have to ask, what are we being told here? All right. I have another point of values and beliefs that come through these stories as we look at Israel's history, that is, Israel telling stories to itself. It's the last point I'll make in this part of the lecture. We've talked about the chosen people. We've talked about going back to the beginning of time. We've talked about nomads versus city dwellers. We've talked about the strange absence of a political structure, but the Father blessing. Finally, I'll make this last point. The values taught through the stories, and that is, underlying it all, the absolute and unswerving faith. The faith of the patriarchs. The faith of the patriarchs. That is, despite the fact that Sarah is 90, she will have a son, despite the fact you're surrounded by enemies that hate you with the ferocity of an older brother who has been wronged, despite the apparent absurdity of it all, the age of the patriarchs teaches us that they kept their faith. This is something that reason cannot grasp. Take the faith of Abraham when he's told to kill his son. This is not a moral thing to do, but his faith is so strong that he doesn't listen to his reason, which says it's not a moral thing to do, and he's willing to do it anyway. There are some accounts somehow that this shows a heartlessness in Abraham, or maybe a cruelty in Abraham. No, I think it shows his extraordinary faith precisely because he loved his son. How many times in that scripture does it say, God said to Abraham, take your son, your only son? 3 or 4 or 5 times it says, your only son, the one you love. And if somehow the Israelites can grasp what that meant, to defy reason, to defy morality for a higher faith, and that finally is what, I think in a very vivid way, what illuminates the faith-reason dichotomy I was talking about earlier. Faith cannot be proven nor disproven. And Abraham had that faith. So it's not inferior. It's a faith in defiance of all rationality. Why would this be? Well, because that faith, the Israelites believed, was essential for their survival. It's essential for their survival. Now, there's an issue that I've been avoiding, and maybe this has occurred to you, and I think this is the right time to ask it. That is to say, there may be a collective truth in telling these stories for a given people, but were they true? In other words, did Abraham exist? Did Jacob exist? Was there really a scene when he went on the top of Mount Moriah? So we move to part 3, the history of Israel. This is, I hope, not merely clever to divide this up, Israel's history versus the history of Israel. What I mean by this simply is saying Israel's history is the history Israelites told themselves from generation to generation, eventually putting together in this book. But the history of Israel, by this I mean, what do historians teach us about what actually happened? Where do we pick up the traces of this group of people? Well, the first point to make is that there is no independent confirmation of Abraham, Isaac, or for that matter, Moses. There is no historical record, apart from the legends and chronicles we have in this book, that could be confirmed by archaeology, of the existence of Abraham, Isaac, Moses. In a sense, the age of the patriarchs. The age of the patriarchs exists in storytelling. We don't know if they existed. If they did exist, we can give rough dates when they might have lived. And we do this tracing back through genealogies. We do this also through patterns of migration. We would roughly place, as is on the handout, the age of the patriarchs 2000 to 1200 BC. As I say, we do this working back from when we know people actually lived, namely David, Saul, and Solomon. And then we can work backwards. If they were to exist, if we follow the genealogies, when did they live? Roughly 2000 through 1200 BC. But I'll tell you some very interesting things. First, there was a vast migration out of Mesopotamia around 2000 BC. There was, we know, archaeologically, a vast movement of peoples leaving the cities, living as nomads, living in tents, westward out of Mesopotamia about 2000 BC. Does this prove anything? No. But what it suggests is that in Israel's history, just as there was a collective memory that the cradle of civilization was in Mesopotamia, perhaps there was also a collective memory that there was a vast migration. So it only makes sense that God said to Abram, go. Another very alluring detail I learned from reading articles on archaeology, that there is an archive now in northern Mesopotamia. It's called the Meri Archive, M-E-R-I. Archaeologists have dated it to about 1800 BC. That's well in the age of the patriarchs. And in this Meri Archive, there are names of local residents of the area. And those names include Abram, Ishmael, and Laban. Does it prove, therefore, that it's our Abram, Ishmael, and Laban? Not necessarily, but it does prove that these were common names. And it again confirms what these stories in Israel's history are telling us, that maybe it's a collective legend, but it certainly has its roots in the way things were. When is our first real glimpse of the Israelites? I hope I'm not surprised by this next slide. The first glimpse of the Israelites comes on a pharaonic tomb in Egypt, dating from about 1200 BC, describing a group of slaves from the north who have been freed. This, unfortunately, is not that tomb. This is, however, from ancient Egypt. This is a depiction of Semitic tribes with an indication of slavery you see in the hieroglyphics up in one corner. This is not the inscription that refers to the free group of slaves, but it is a depiction from Egypt of foreign tribes living in Egypt. Now, why am I mentioning Egypt? You have heard about Exodus. The book of Exodus, which we will not read, is literally a story of going out. That's what Exodus means, literally, going out. Exodus tells the continuation of the story of the age of the patriarchs. Joseph is the son of Jacob. Joseph is sold into slavery and taken to Egypt.